are live. Hi everybody. I am joined tonight by Delaney Davis, and it is really a pleasure for me to get to sit down here and have this conversation with you. It's an incredibly important conversation. Delaney is an advocate for survivors of sexual assault at UT, and I am so grateful. Can you share a little bit about who you are and why this is important to you? And you're on mute.
Yeah, for sure. So, hi, like Julie said, my name is Delaney, and I'm the president of It's On Us at UT Austin. And we are a student organization that works to empower survivors, not only on our campus, but and beyond. I'm currently not in Austin, which is why you see my childhood bedroom behind me. I'm in Grapevine, Texas, in Tarrant County. But yeah, I'm super excited and honored to be here. I think a lot of people don't think of survivor issues as being on the ballot, but that's inaccurate. This year and every year, survivor justice and the chance to enact bold, progressive legislation that favors survivors is always on the ballot. And we really have that opportunity with Julie. And so that's why I'm really excited to be here to talk about something people may not be thinking about when they go to the polls, but something that their vote will definitely impact.
I am so proud of you for doing this, because survivor justice, I gotta say, when I was growing up, I'm 48 now, there was no such thing as survivor justice. I mean, there was and there wasn't. I mean, you might have had a trial, if you were assaulted, you might have had a trial. Maybe there was conviction, maybe there wasn't. Maybe it was never taken seriously, but there was never this framework of survivor justice. So I'm going to ask you, what does survivor justice mean to you?
To me, I think it means that the survivor is able to reclaim some of the autonomy that was taken away from them. Sexual assault and rape are crimes that are horribly destructive and horribly harmful, because it leaves the survivor, no matter their background, no matter their gender identity, no matter their sexual orientation, feeling like they've lost a part of themselves and they've lost control over themselves and their own stories. And so I think, to me, survivor justice means creating the conditions that allow survivors to take that autonomy back and to kind of heal on their own terms. Healing looks different for every survivor. Not every survivor wants to go through the criminal justice system, and we have to respect that. And I think, again, just reclaiming that autonomy and creating the conditions in which survivors can heal as they wish.
I agree. And so there are so many, I'm thinking right now, like, there's so many pathways for us to go down to begin this conversation. But one of the ones I want to talk about is, one, sexual assault on UT's campus. And can you give us some stats and what we're dealing with on UT's campus? Because we have the largest university in Texas, is right here in Austin, University of Texas at Austin, with a very robust Greek life. Not that it all happens in Greek life, but I'm sure a big chunk of it does. But this has also been a school that has had some professors who have been accused of their own sexual misconduct. So do you want to share with us what it's looking like at UT, just to kind of lay the framework for that?
Yeah, for sure. So off the top of my head, I can let you know that according to a 2017 report conducted by the university, I believe mainly through the School of Social Work, about 1 in 5 undergraduate women experienced rape or sexual assault by the time that she graduated from UT. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned UT being a huge public university, because the majority of sexual assaults occur off campus. And the reason why I mentioned that is because recently the Department of Education, headed by Betsy DeVos, kind of rescinded Obama's regulations in the 2014 Dear Colleague letter and completely changed how Title IX operates on college campuses. And mind you, this was during a pandemic in which educators from high school to university level were scrambling to figure out how they're going to prepare for remote learning, whether or not they're going to open. And she dropped these rules and basically said, in May, you have until August 14th to come up with a legal framework to get these adopted. And my point is, these rules were seen as incredibly re-traumatizing and victimizing for survivors. For one, it made the definition of sexual assault extremely narrow. Now it has to be extremely severe, pervasive, and offensive, and that's much more narrow than the past definition. Two, schools are not allowed to investigate incidences of sexual assault that occur off campus, which can be completely detrimental to a school like UT, when the majority of assaults occur off campus. And three, and this is often seen as a really big issue for survivors, that a survivor that elects to go through the Title IX process can be cross-examined live by an advisor of the respondent, who's their abuser or the person that assaulted them. And luckily at UT responded by creating a separate framework so that incidents of sexual assault that occur off campus will still be investigated. It's just not going to be investigated through Title IX, which advocates worked super hard for. But it's definitely worrisome that the protection for survivors, if you don't go to a school like UT where they didn't make those changes, if you're assaulted off campus, you could be out of luck. They couldn't investigate it. And to me, that's kind of how I see it. Not only do we have, these horrible statistics at UT, like 1 in 5 women, that's horrible, but we also have this ever-changing framework that survivors don't know necessarily what the rules are, and it's changing, and that's made even worse during a pandemic.
So I want to talk to you about more locally, for survivors. What are some things, because I'm thinking about the current way we kind of grill survivors. If a survivor goes to a hospital after a rape or sexual assault, and then the police come in, they get grilled by, sometimes can be male police officer. I'm talking about a female rape, if a woman is raped. But again, I acknowledge that this is not a gender specific assault. This happens to truly to every, male, female, non-binary, trans, it happens, right? So what are some improvements? So I'm trying to get is, what are some improvements? Because I do know survivors who have gone through the judicial process only to feel on the other side almost re-traumatized by the experience with police departments, or the fact that they'll never even be an active investigation because perhaps their survivor knew the person who was the abuser. So what are some of the improvements we could make to help that healing process for survivors, especially when it comes to criminal justice? And I think that this is probably where, when you're saying that, no, survivor justice is part of can be part of a legislative space, this is kind of what I'm thinking of. How do we make it better? Because clearly for a lot of survivors, the system we have right now isn't one that is equitable. It's not, certainly sometimes doesn't believe the person. And that in and of itself, again, can be re-traumatizing.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. Survivor justice and healing is a different thing for every single survivor based on their experiences. And a lot of survivors don't want to go through the criminal justice system because of how traumatizing it can be and how rare it is often to receive justice through that avenue. You can look at the statistics, prosecution rates for sexual assault cases is very low. But I think it goes back to creating conditions in which survivors are allowed to heal on their own terms. And so I think things that we would not normally think of as survivor issues are actually survivor issues in practice. For example, gun safety. ensuring that we have things like red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of abusers could greatly benefit survivors. Ensuring that everyone has access to safe and affordable housing, so if a survivor wants to leave traumatic or abusive environments, they're able to. Making sure that people can live sustainably on a livable minimum wage. And I know one of your big things is universal childcare. Like you said, we were talking earlier before that sometimes survivors don't leave abusive and traumatic environments simply because they don't have the financial means to. If you can't leave because you don't have enough money, if you don't know where you're going to go, if you don't know who's going to take care of your kid, leaving may not be the best option for you, even though you might be in an extremely abusive environment.
Right. And I think that is, for a survivor to be able to have that truly that independence, to be able to live, to step out of that abusive situation and live an independent life, free from harm. Frequently, if let's say, the survivor is a mother of 3 kiddos that, aren't quite in school, but let's say they're, ages 4, 2, and, a newborn. Then we say women, because this typically will help women. We need that ability. It will help one be able to leave a situation that is an incredibly harmful situation, but it also allows a woman to have that independence to be able to raise her kids in a safer environment. I want to talk about going back to some of the criminal aspects. Before we got on this Zoom call, what one of the jurisdictions in my district is doing that I think is an incredibly novel approach to dealing with domestic violence. And sometimes domestic violence takes the form of physical violence. Sometimes it takes the form of sexual violence, because I want to remind people that domestic violence sometimes is sexual violence. So in Burleson, Texas, the northern part of this district, it's one of the suburbs of Fort Worth. They have implemented a policy where social workers go to every call where there's an instance of domestic violence. So the social workers ride with the police officers to the home, because what the social workers can do is take the testimony of the survivor. And just like you said, survivors don't always want to go through the court system because they may not be believed, or it may just re-traumatize them. In this case, a social worker can take the testimony of the survivor, and that testimony is admissible to court. So if the survivor says, I can't do this, you actually have somebody who was there present at the scene who can testify, and there can be accountability to the abuser. So I thought, oh my gosh, in a small town Texas, to take such a progressive step to address domestic violence. The other thing that they do is they've made an ordinance where it's illegal to commit domestic violence in front of a child, so in front of a minor. So that's an additional charge that can be brought against an abuser, is if they do that with children present. So I think there are some very concrete steps at even a local level that can be taken to help, survivors.
For sure. I think what you just said and what Burleson did is really truly a testament to the fact that local politics matter. From everyone from your city council member to whoever's representing you in Congress, these people matter, and the choices that these people make can have impacts on survivors throughout your district and throughout Texas as a whole.
Right. So I want to kind of shifting a little bit, but to a case that's, been in the public's mind since April, and that is the case of Specialist Vanessa Guillén from Fort Hood, who unfortunately was murdered at Fort Hood. We still don't know the totality of the circumstances surrounding this case. We know that another person shortly thereafter, Sergeant Elder Fernandez, had also been complaining of sexual assault, and he was found dead. And so clearly there's a problem at Fort Hood. I can't tell you, I've lost count of the number of soldiers who have died this year, but I think it's upwards of 24, 25 just since March. And so clearly there is a problem with command at Fort Hood. But what are some of the ways that we can, because I know Congresswomen are looking at this right now. There are women in Congress. Roger Williams has done nothing about this, by the way. The guy who actually represents Fort Hood has done nothing about this. So Fort Hood, just for folks who don't know, it's the largest military installation in the United States. It's in Central Texas. It's gerrymandered itself into 2 congressional districts. The 2 congressmen who represent that district have said nothing about this. But there are women in Congress who are taking this up, even though it's not in their district. But what are the things that, if you could advise them, what would you advise them? Like what should some of the systemic changes that you can bring, not just to Fort Hood, but to the military as a whole? What would that look like?
Yeah, I think first of all, to kind of frame this problem, and I remember, you've been very vocal about this, obviously, since it's in your district that you're looking to represent. Mm-hmm. And I remember an article from you that you tweeted on your Twitter said something along the lines of about 35% of women at Fort Hood were complaining of sexual harassment, sexual abuse. And so I think the first thing is to stop thinking of this as a minor problem when it's something that happens pretty frequently. It's not a special case. It's not something that happens once in a blue moon. It's something that happens pretty frequently, unfortunately, right? And so I think if we, for one, kind of shift that perspective and, stop thinking of this as, you only think about it when, a tragedy like the death of Vanessa Guillén happens, we shouldn't be only thinking about that then, because it happens way before this, and it has happened before this. And if we don't take proactive action, it will continue to happen. So that's the first thing I would advise. I would also, I know it's hard because I don't have a ton of knowledge of the military, but I think that it needs to be made clear on these Army bases and in training that sexual abuse and sexual harassment is not going to be conduct that is tolerated on military bases or in military grounds, and to let those that live there and those that are in the Army know that, here are the avenues to report if something does happen to you, and to put in retaliation policies, because a lot of people don't realize, and this happens on college campuses as well, sometimes when survivors choose to report their assault, especially when you have survivors on the graduate level who are, working very closely under faculty, they'll often be punished with bad grades or something like that, along the lines of trying to get someone in trouble because they spoke out about an injustice they were going through. And so I think what really needs to happen is there needs to be a system in which members of the Army, no matter their gender, know that, one, this is conduct that's not going to be tolerated. Here are the avenues in which you report this conduct. Here's who's going to handle the investigation, and here's when you can receive a response. Because from what I can see, it seems like people are, being brave enough to report, and we should all acknowledge that reporting is something that takes a lot out of you, and it's a very mentally strenuous thing. And so it seems like these people are willing to make reports, but no one's following through on it. And so there needs to be some type of system in which survivors know, this is where I report, this is who I talk to, and this is what the steps of the investigation are look like, and when I can expect to hear back from that.
Right. Well, and I think to your point, nobody who has experienced, sexual abuse on any level from a superior should have to go through that superior to report the sexual abuse. And so, there are, I met a woman, oh my goodness, I remember this. When we were getting folks registered to vote, we were actually going house to house. We were using this website called Map the Vote. So you could find houses that didn't have registered voters, and you could go up and say, hi, I'd like to, it shows that you're not registered, or there are no registered voters here. Can we get you registered? So one lady I talked to, for whatever reason, she even said that, she's like, I don't know why I'm sharing my story with you, but I saw her and I was like, hey, would you like to get registered to vote? And she was unhoused. She was living out of her car. She at that time had been staying for I think 2 months in somebody's bedroom, but she's like, my car is always packed because I never know how long I get to stay. So truly, somebody who's really unhoused, but for whatever reason, she shared her story with me. And she had been, she was a survivor, and her commanding officer was the abuser. And that clearly had happened many years prior to when she and I met each other. But it was almost as if it had happened that day when she was telling me. And she tried to report it and it didn't go anywhere. So this is what you said, this has been happening before. This has clearly been the way that they've handled it. Now, I can't speak for every post in the military or every base, but at least with respect to Fort Hood, I can say that because I've met the survivors who have experienced this many years before, and there was no justice. And in fact, it was turned on them. They were made to feel really bad about even reporting it in the first place.
And yeah, and I think to your point, talking about going through your superior, I think that makes the situation so much more difficult, because when you're accusing someone who's in a higher rank than you, as could be the case in the military and the army, it makes you feel like, one, why am I even reporting this in the first place? Like, yeah. Two, it makes it less likely that you're going to be believed, because there's this huge power dynamic in which you're accusing someone who's known throughout the base or, has a lot of power. And I think, like you said, I think we need to kind of strip the title, stop associating the title with not being able to be an abuser, because anyone can abuse, unfortunately, no matter your gender, your sexual identity, your occupation. Everyone is capable of harming someone else. And I think forcing someone to go through their superior, when even if they didn't go through their superior, there's a chance they may not be believed, is horrible. Reporting an assault is hard enough. It's even harder when that person has a huge amount of power over you. And so I think it's great that you brought that up.
Yeah, well, I think that has to be part of this, congressional investigation as to what's happening. And I get that Fort Hood is not an isolated incident. I imagine if it's happening there, it's happening at other places as well. Well, we know that. I mean, sexual violence is something that every community experiences. It's not, and again, you're right. Your zip code doesn't matter, your gender or your identity doesn't matter. Sexual violence can occur anywhere and honestly to anyone. So it's creating pathways where people feel heard and supported and believed. So I think with respect to at least the military, we have to ensure, I think about it like this: in a regular business, typically, like if you're in a corporate America, and somebody is, being sexually harassing, there are avenues that you can take that don't involve you having to say, I brought it to this person first. I had to, and then let's see if they'll take it on. So no, they have actual HR departments that take that on and start investigations. And typically, if somebody is in HR who's committing those abuses, there's alternative means, so that you're never really having to, or I should say the sophisticated corporations are like this. They want to try to minimize that because it is a legal liability to them in a big way. So ensuring that there are paths that, and I almost think that for folks in the military who are survivors of sexual violence and abuse and harassment, there needs to be a path outside of the military for them to be able to report it. So, because there is a certain culture within the military that I think almost would exacerbate it if somebody brought it up. And I think it's incredibly courageous that Vanessa Guillén at least shared it, at a minimum with her family, because her family knew about it. I think she probably did share it on post, and I think they did know, and I think they ignored it or didn't want to believe it. And I think the same with Sergeant Elder Fernandez, who had reported it. You know, those people are incredibly courageous because you're going against the grain and you're admitting to being in a place of vulnerability.
No,
And, you know, yeah.
yeah, no, I think to your point, again, you know, at UT and other universities, for whatever its flaws, you know, there's Title IX. You have that avenue. And like you said, at many corporations, you have an HR person you can go to. You know, signing up for the military and giving your life in order to protect people throughout our country is not you're not signing away your right to justice or your right to be protected. And so people within the military do deserve that path, whether, and I do agree with you, I think we should have options within the military, but also outside, because as we've seen in the situation with Fort Hood, there's been multiple situations where people have bravely come forward, and I want to talk about it's super brave to come forward about an assault, to admit, like you said, to mention, you know, something so horrible happening, to be so vulnerable about your experience, and to know that you will likely be met with a lot of harassment in response to your report, or you will likely not be believed. You know, I'm in awe of survivors every day because they are beyond brave for making that choice to report. But we need to honor their willingness and their bravery reporting, for having those avenues and for taking those reports seriously. And I think we need to have that within the military, and we also need to have it outside, because clearly there's something going on at Fort Hood, and I'm sure other bases around the country.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, I think there are a lot of things, and I'm grateful for the women who are taking this on in Congress and who want to see justice for Specialist Vanessa Guillén and all of the survivors who serve us faithfully in uniform. And it is heartbreaking when one tragedy turns into another tragedy. And that's what we have with respect to Vanessa Guillén and with respect to Elder Fernandez. So share with us, if you will, what other, you know, you brought it up earlier and you mentioned a few, but if you want to dive into some of those aspects of, hey, it may not look like on the surface survivor justice, but what are the things that you can think of that folks who are like contemplating office, what are the things that the policies that they can have that would support that? And I honestly think healthcare for everyone is part of that justice platform for survivors. Because if a woman or a man, or you know, anybody is harmed in a way that compromises their health long term, and even short term, you know, it's one thing to be a survivor, but to be met on the other side of an ER visit with, you know, thousands of dollars of bills, is just really adding insult to injury. So what are some other areas where you think that's not traditionally, I wouldn't think of that as survivor justice, but in reality, there's that component that is?
Yeah, I think one, like you mentioned, healthcare, and adding on to that, I don't think a lot of people realize that a lot of the medical exams that survivors go through after being assaulted are, while they're necessary and for some situations, and they collect super valuable information that can be used in legal proceedings, they're very traumatizing sometimes. I mean, you know, you are naked, someone is looking all throughout your body, they're seeing, you know, basically what happened to you through the record of what happens on your body. And so having to pay like an $1,000 bill for that test only makes your situation even worse.
Yeah.
And then if you aren't able to pay for that bill, you know, you may not be able to hire an attorney if you want to go through the civil route, you know, so it all has compounding effects. Yeah. I'm going to pick another aspect that I think people don't really think of. I think I would probably go with universal healthcare, or not universal healthcare, universal childcare, sorry. just because I think a lot of people view that as a solely economic issue, and it is. It certainly has its economic benefits, but I think a lot of people don't realize that sometimes it's not just the survivor that's affected by the trauma. Like we talked about earlier, if a survivor is, unfortunately goes through an abusive situation, they're not, going to be able to leave because they can't afford to take off work or to have someone to take care of the kids. And so I'd probably say universal childcare and making sure that we have a livable wage in this country, because a lot of people like to ask, why don't you just leave? A lot of people think it's super easy to just pack up your bags and go, but people aren't just, their belongings and they can just pick up and go. So I think people forget that a lot of survivors are mothers. They have children, they have jobs. Some of these jobs may not be particularly well paying and may be paying an abysmal wage for the work they're doing. They're not going to be able to save up the money to go and leave. They may not be able to take time off work to recover
Right.
and to make sure, their situation is in order. And so I think I would say making sure that we have a livable wage in this country and making sure that we have universal childcare, because I think a lot of people don't realize how influential someone's economic position can be on their ability to leave an abusive situation.
I think that's probably, I don't think anybody wants to intentionally stay in a situation that is harmful to their mental health, their physical health, certainly their, with their, if they have children, what their children are seeing. But I do think that there are probably a lot of people who feel stuck perhaps in a situation because of the economic ramifications.
And a lot of people forget that financial abuse can be a form of domestic violence and violence that survivors go through. A lot of abusers capitalize on the fact that their survivor may not be making a ton of money, or may not have insurance, or may not have the means to go out and leave. And they actively work to make sure that survivor can't get a job, make sure that survivor doesn't have healthcare. And while we have policies that continually keep people from accessing healthcare, keep people from accessing housing, keep people from making a livable wage for the work that they're doing, we're only going to perpetuate the financial abuse that some abusers are inflicting on survivors.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think it could be arguable. Even a universal basic income could be incredibly beneficial as well. So it's we know those stories. We've seen the stories of partners who feel trapped and don't know how to leave. They don't know how. They don't, because there aren't the resources. There's no support network outside of where they're living, and perhaps that financial, maybe perhaps living in that home that is abusive is a way that at least they're not having to deal with the financial ramifications of being on their own. But yeah, I think there are a lot of progressive policies that can help people who are trying to gain fresh starts, so to speak. But I also, I know we're probably, whatever you want to talk about, we can talk about, but I wanted to bring up again the fact that, we have sometimes a culture of, that doesn't always believe victims, or I shouldn't say victims, survivors, excuse me, pardon my language, survivors. And when it comes to even the way, again, police handle questioning of survivors, there can be such a not only a disbelief perhaps, but also almost a verbal assault or threatening sometimes survivors with jail for being emotional in a situation that is an incredibly emotional, it rightfully so. I mean, I don't think any of us would ever say it's reasonable for a survivor to be told to shut up when police are called, and yet that does happen. And I hate to say that it happens with more frequency than I like, but it does. It happens with more frequency than I like. And I know because I've talked to survivors about this. And I know there's a whole debate on, justice with respect to, Black Lives Matter. What do you do with police departments? I do think there's a huge opportunity to do some massive reform within police departments when it comes to survivor justice and even how they question survivors. And that is something I would like to see, because it's to be in that place of you've just been physically traumatized, and then you have this outside that's supposed to be protective but isn't really taking a stand of being protective and helpful. It's almost adversarial. I think, I mean, are there any ideas you have with respect to their like programs? What would you suggest? And I don't even feel like I'm doing it justice, but I do know, I do know stories where this is the norm when police are called to certain situations.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think sexual assault is kind of unique in that it's one of the few crimes in which the victim or the survivor is often put on trial instead of the perpetrator. Often the victim is discredited for literally whatever reason in the book, was drinking, invited the person over to their house. I don't know, even things like, bringing up someone's sexual history and to suggest that, someone having a lot of sexual partners in the past means that they deserved what happened to them. And so I think we have a huge problem in our police departments and our criminal justice system, in that a lot of survivors feel like that's one of the few places they can turn, and they're often met with, abuse and, such neglect that's almost, I've heard some survivors say that it's almost as worse as the initial trauma.
Yeah.
And so you're right, we have a ton of work to do regarding how police officers serve, because it is serving survivors of sexual trauma, sexual assault. I think one of the biggest ones is, I think we need to make sure that we have options for justice that aren't solely limited to the criminal justice system. And I'm very big on this because, again, like I said earlier, I think healing looks different for everyone. A lot of people may not want to go through the criminal justice system for a variety of different reasons. I think you can name almost every reason in the book. And something I really like that's happening at UT is there's a group called the Coalition Against Sexual Misconduct, and they were probably the biggest organizers around the sit-in protests against the sexual misconduct and the lack of transparency from the university regarding professors at UT. And something that they've been pushing to implement, and the Title IX office will be implementing, is a restorative justice program that doesn't necessarily rely on the typical punitive structures that often fail survivors in the end. And I think for some survivors, all they really want to know is that their abuser understands what they did, why what they did was wrong, and how not to do that again in the future, and to not do that again in the future. And so I think what I would like to see is, a huge part of many cities' overall budgets goes towards police. But I don't see, and so we talk about how the goal of police is to provide public safety. Regardless of whether or not you believe that or not, why can't, if we're aiming to protect public safety, why can't some of that funding go towards providing more caseworkers, more victims funding? Because some situations, victims can apply for funding after an assault. Why can't that go towards providing free counseling for a survivor after an assault? Why can't that go towards covering free medical examinations after an assault? I think sometimes we have a little bit of a limited idea of what public safety can be, and that it always has to be through one certain avenue, when providing these types of things, in addition to housing and livable income and healthcare, are ways that we can serve and help survivors heal that are outside the criminal justice system. So what I'd like to see is kind of, I guess, more creativity in how we serve survivors, because it doesn't always have to be one way, because no survivor situation is one way. Everyone's different and everyone has different needs.
And you brought up a really good point, mental health care. For many people, because of our current healthcare system, mental health care is cost prohibitive, or may not be covered by an insurance plan. So if you seek it, it's out of pocket. So I think that's an excellent point to bring up, that this is an aspect where you could provide healthcare and mental health care, and this be a fabulous service for survivors. I think something that would be really helpful to our communities and healing for our communities. But I also see that sometimes we could have, we have such I think you brought it up about where abusers sometimes, or survivors sometimes want their abusers to know what they did was wrong and not to do it again, and how to avoid doing it, which is great if that's possible. I don't know that every abuser has that self-awareness to do that, but certainly in some cases, if counseling is helpful for that abuser as well, to stop cycles of that, then again, another reason why we should have universal health care, and which would encompass mental health care as well. So I think that you brought up a very good point. Thank you for sharing that. So we have, a few minutes left. What else would you want folks to know? How can we get involved? What can we do if we're just watching? What are the things that are calls to action, so to speak?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things. I would say first, if someone does come to you sharing a situation about, their trauma, make sure to believe them. At the end of the day, if you're not a member, if you're not a police officer, if you're not an investigator in the DA's office or something like that, it's not your job to play investigator. Believe them, affirm them, and tell them that what happened to them wasn't okay. I feel like a lot of people forget how powerful affirmations can be, but I've talked to a lot of people, and they let me know, you saying that to me made me feel really good. You saying that to me made me feel way better about my situation. So I think a small thing you can do, and I hope you never have to do it, because I hope you don't know anyone who goes through it, but in all likelihood, because of statistics, someone that has, or someone who will. So I think, one, believing a survivor and affirming their situation, letting them know that you believe them in a world where they are often not believed, is a huge thing. I think, two, there's so many things you can do. I would say pay attention to the organizations doing the local work in your community. There's an amazing group in Austin called the Survivor Justice Project that has done a lot of work reforming how the criminal justice system treats survivors, and that's located in Austin. And they do phenomenal work, and there's people who are doing the work already. And I think you can ask those people what they need, ask those groups what they're doing and how you contribute, because I'm sure in most communities, some communities are smaller than others, but there are groups doing the work in your community, and ask them how you can help. Three, I would say, remember that, like we kind of talked about, it's kind of been a theme of our entire conversation. A lot of issues you don't think about as being survivor issues are survivor issues. Advocating for better access to healthcare, advocating for livable wage, advocating for common sense gun safety laws. Those help survivors. They help people who aren't survivors as well, but they do help survivors. And I think we can't separate that mentality. We have to look at it as one thing. And then I would say 4, register to vote. Obviously, I feel like a lot of people forget that we aren't just voting for president in the fall. We're voting for amazing candidates like Julie and other people who are running up and down the ballot to ensure that survivors get the help they need. And then also going back to my help local groups thing, I think people need to remember that local politics shapes a lot of survivor justice. So, pay attention to your city council elections, pay attention to your city council meetings. The one good thing about, and the one, not one good thing, but coronavirus has made, I think, city council meetings more accessible. You have the opportunity to call in now. And I think instead of having to go, and I think a lot of people, we kind of saw with the conversations about city funding for police that the actions of city council really matter. And survivor justice is often decided in city councils. And so I think people really need to pay attention to who is representing them on city council, who is running for their city council seat. And if you have an issue with how things are being mentioned or being addressed in your city, to bring that up to your city council member, because a lot of these issues, like you kind of brought up with the situation in Burleson, you wouldn't think that, a little small town like Burleson would enact something so progressive. But if we push our city legislators or city representatives to enact those changes, we can make tangible change that really affects survivors.
Oh, absolutely. And pay attention to, who's running for DA, county commissioner, sheriff, for crying out loud. I mean, we see there's a sheriff that's gone, I mean, it's truly a rogue sheriff in Williamson County right now, who has, for a little bit of television infamy, has had people killed in his custody. Under his watch. We saw in the news this week, there was a case of a woman who was a neighbor called to report domestic violence. And when the sheriff's deputies arrived, they slammed her to the ground because she said, no, he's not here. And no, you can't come in and search my place. She's a survivor, and they re-traumatized her. And in fact, the whole thing was caught on body camera. And the sheriff's deputy said to her, you're the reason that we had to, come here in the first place. If you had just left him or whatever, putting all of the blame, heaping the blame on her for that situation and for the abuse that they additionally threw on her, including slamming her to the ground and putting her in a headlock. I'm like, it matters. These roles matter. And we have an opportunity to vote him out. So vote him out. And if you live in Williamson County, do not vote for Sheriff Chody. No, he needs to go.
To your point, unfortunately, there is a lot of abuse, sexual or otherwise, that occur within our law enforcement jurisdictions. Whether they're police officers themselves, like the situation you mentioned. And I think, unfortunately, we know that in prisons, sexual abuse runs rampant. And no one deserves abuse ever. And so sometimes we think that, we're doing the right thing with having these law enforcement agencies, but what good are these agencies doing if they're providing justice when sometimes they perpetuate abuse themselves, like you mentioned? And so I think, to your point, that's extremely valuable, that we need to be paying attention to who is running our law enforcement agencies to make sure that they're actually providing people with justice and not perpetuating and making abuse even worse, like the situation you mentioned, or within prisons.
Yeah, it's again, to bring it back, everything is local. There are some things absolutely we can do at a federal level. Violence Against Women's Act, to reauthorize the Violence Against Women's Act, which would also not just cover domestic partnerships, but even just a relationship that was, could have been boyfriend, girlfriend, 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 boyfriend, boyfriend. Those situations, those are not presently covered under the domestic or the Violence Against Women's Act. And I know that they tried to amend it, and I do believe it passed in the House. I think it's still sitting in Mitch McConnell's graveyard.
Yeah, that's a huge issue, because often rates of sexual assault and gendered violence are worse in LGBTQ communities, and often these people go to the law enforcement agencies looking and seeking justice, and they're often met with homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, and that's completely unacceptable. Sexual abuse, unfortunately, is a crime that, like we said, affects everyone, no matter your gender, no matter your zip code, no matter your
education level, nothing. It doesn't,
doesn't matter. And I think we should also make sure to keep this intersectional, making sure that no matter your race, often Black women are not believed and often experience a ton of abuse by police. Gay men and women are often met with a ton of homophobia when they try to report. Trans women and trans men who try to report are, often thrown to the side. I know there was a situation, I can't remember where, but there was these trans women who it was recorded on video where they were being abused by some individuals, and the police office didn't even do anything about it. And so I think we need to remember that identities intersect with this, and we need to make sure that justice doesn't only go to the richest, the wealthiest, the whitest, the most well off, that it helps everyone no matter their identity. And I think that's a great point that you brought it up, that it's unfortunately marginalized communities often bear the brunt of abuse by law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, agreed. Well, in our final closing moments, is there anything else you want to share? And thank you again. Thank you, because I think this is a conversation we don't have a lot, because it is an uncomfortable conversation. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have these conversations, even the ones that are uncomfortable, even the ones that, we like, I don't want to think about that. That's, but this happens. And I think, again, having these conversations allows us to have the awareness of how do we interact with survivors. I think, to your point of saying, affirming them, how do we ensure that justice, that the communities that have been marginalized historically are at the center of justice conversations. So in these final moments, any closing thoughts, remarks about this? Thank you again for helping in this area.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Like you said, it's an uncomfortable one, but I think this conversation that we had kind of shows the value in having these uncomfortable situations, because, as horrible as these situations are, talking about them and discussing them is a way that we can brainstorm progressive solutions, like livable wage, like gun safety laws, like access to healthcare that truly help survivors. We have to engage in these uncomfortable situations and hold all members of our community accountable, to make sure that even if you aren't an abuser yourself, you're working to create an environment in which survivors can heal on their own terms. And I think, like we said, I think we've talked a lot about the bravery in reporting, and I just want to say reporting is so brave, and I commend any survivor that chooses to come forward with their story, but I also commend anyone who chooses not to. What you do with your own story is yours, and like I said at the beginning, what you do should be on your own terms, and I will always work to create a world in which people have the ability to tell and they have the ability to heal, whether or not they choose to report. And we need to keep working for progressive policy solutions, like we've talked about, to ensure that, as traumatic and as horrible as going through a sexual assault can be, it should not determine your entire future. You should be able to write your story, live your life as you want to. And I think that is what we're voting for in November. It's one of the many things we're voting for in November. And so you're not just casting a vote for a candidate or someone running. You're not just casting a vote for them. You're casting a vote for survivors, and you're casting a vote to make a change for a bunch of people you don't even know and you may not even meet. So I think people should just keep that in mind when they're heading to the polls in November or October if you're voting early.
Oh, good reminder that early voting begins October 13th through October 30th here in Texas. You can register to vote or change your voter registration address, or if you've had a name update, by October 5th. That's the last day that you can do that. If you're going to vote by mail, you have to get your application to do so by October 23rd. But I do not suggest waiting to the last minute. I encourage everybody to do that now. And it's a beautiful point. We all know somebody in our lives who's been affected in one way or another. So what a wonderful way to honor part of that healing is through your vote. and voting for folks who care about this and want to prioritize some part of the healing framework for this. And I will say, I'm not going to reveal who, but this is an incredibly personal issue for me. And so I will always fight for survivors. I might sometimes confuse like language, but you're not a victim, you are a survivor, and this does not determine anybody's value. So if that's anything that I can share with my the people who are watching this, who are survivors, it does not determine your value at all. So, Delaney, thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so grateful. And if people want to find you, you're on Facebook. Are you on Facebook or are you on Twitter? If they wanted to have questions and they wanted to DM you, how could they find you?
Yeah, you could just look up my name, Delaney Davis. I'll reply to any messages, or you can look up It's On Us at UT Austin and send us a message there. We are also on Twitter and Instagram at It's On Us at UT.
Great. Thank you, Delaney. And thank you to everybody who watched us this evening and participated, remotely, virtually, again, on this very incredibly important conversation. Delaney, thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Bye. All right. I have to figure out how to get off this. Hang on. We'll get this. Technology is not my strong suit, but we are going to close it out now. Sorry about that, y'all. Bye.